Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. James Joshua Coleman, but I go by Josh Coleman. I am an assistant professor of English education in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Jose State University. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns, and I'm delighted to be here today. I took sort of a circuitous route to what I currently research, which is really focused on the imagination and the impact of children's literature upon the development of the imagination from childhood into adulthood. And specifically, I'm interested in what it means to have grown up in worlds where maybe you didn't see yourself represented, for example. We know that in children's literature specifically that the world has been sort of iconically described as the all-white world of children's literature. And this was in 1965 by Nancy Lyric. But even today in 2021, that landscape has not changed nearly as much as it should. It doesn't reflect the racial dynamics that currently exist in the United States and abroad. And furthermore, it doesn't reflect other valences of identity. So if we're thinking intersectionally, for myself, though I saw my whiteness reflected in almost every children's picture book that I encountered in the Deep South, as a queer person, as a genderqueer person, I rarely saw myself. And that really slowed my process of understanding my own identity. I grew up in a conservative fundamentalist household, wherein representation was fastidiously controlled. And so now as an academic, I'm trying to think about how we expand the representations that folks have, both in childhood. So I work primarily with English educators, but also for adults, for those of us who are teaching, who, when our imagination formed, you would think after, decades and decades and decades of folks studying the fact that children's literature is just primarily white, that we would live in a very different world than the one that we do in, where last year this data was from 2018, but it hasn't changed nearly as much as it should, but between representations of main characters and protagonists who were white and anthropomorphized animals / things who were protagonists, that represented 77% of the entire landscape of children's literature, which means particularly for children of color, for BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous people of color, it leaves only 23% of the representations, which in no way reflects the actual racial demographics that exist within the United States. So the implication for me is sort of twofold. I think number one, about the fact that publication needs to change, and it is making a lot of effort. So I want to give credit where credit is due, but it needs to change more quickly. And second, I think another place where we need to push is in the face of a canon, in the face of book rooms across the United States, where teachers, particularly English teachers, are invited to teach the exact same books that have always been taught. And again, these are primarily books with white protagonists that focus on American experiences or British experiences in particular. How do we invite teachers who also grew up in K-12 schooling where they learned that those were the best books, the canonical books? How do we invite them to try a book that maybe isn't as fastidiously on the map, but one that speaks to the lived realities of the students sitting in front of them? Or one that provides windows into experiences for students who have only ever seen mirrors in the books that they encountered in childhood. So again, for me, it's really twofold: pushing publishing to do a bit more, a bit faster, and also working with educators to make bold choices in their classrooms, to choose the books that we need to make the world represented, or to make the world represented more, I guess, actually, scratch that. What we need are teachers who are going to make bold choices, who are going to go in and try to think from equity and justice perspectives, who are choosing books that not only sort of represent the world in which we know it to exist. This includes queer people, this includes trans people, this includes people of color, this includes disabled people, but folks who are recognizing that for hundreds of years, these books have been all white. So maybe we don't need to teach white protagonists in our English classroom for 1 year. The likelihood is that teachers or students have encountered those time and time again over the course of decades of schooling. Who we understand ourselves to be shapes the way that we teach. It shapes our values. It shapes how we build curriculum. For me, in my education courses, the text that I choose to put in there and invite my students to read in hopes that they will then invite their students in K-12 turning to read is shaped by my own experiences. And I am someone who is neurodiverse in the sense that, like, I have high functioning anxiety. That is a way that is born of very particular circumstances in my own childhood. And so for me, books have always provided a reflective space. It was the first spaces that I actually ever encountered diversity, despite the efforts of those around me, both in my schooling and in the church that I was raised in, and frankly, by the parent that raised me, to help me see a very particular shade, and I use that word intentionally, of the world. Books gave me a reflective space. It jostled my emotions in ways when I felt like this doesn't match up. What I'm reading in this book doesn't match up with the world that was crafted for me in the representations that were provided for me. So I think books in the hands of teachers can provide that platform, right? I remember when I was looking at sort of my social media feeds immediately after the insurrection, the terrorist actions that occurred in the US Capitol just a few days ago, immediately the next day, teachers were surfing like, this is how you talk about it with your kids, right? Because as teachers, what is happening in the world immediately seeps into our students' lives. It shapes the access and opportunities that are readily afforded to them or not. And we as teachers, whether we are ready or not, are asked to encounter those realities in our classrooms each and every day when we step up. And that happens in K-12, just like it happens in higher ed, right? And so books, for me, are a reflective space. In a world where I'm infinitely anxious about so many things and trying to hit deadlines and responding to emails and all these different things that are sort of constantly clicking in my brain, books allow me a platform to slow down, to think from different perspectives, to consider what it is perhaps my family has been sharing with me that doesn't align with my own values. And I think that I think teachers can do the same thing, right? I think our teachers can choose whatever text it is. So that's the beauty of English, not only to choose a picture book that is wonderfully diverse and has many different representations in it, but to take something, for example, from a media clip, to put it in front of our students and ask them to analyze that critically, to ask good questions, to ask questions of themselves. Why do you think you felt like that when you saw that happen? Where do you think that comes from? And then we can situate that historically, right? We can look at the realities of white supremacist actions. We can look at the sort of ways in which colonialization has shaped education from the ground up in the United States. And we can begin to ask those incredible questions through the text that we present to our young people and in college that invite them to take action, that invite them to fight for the changes that they see as being necessary in the world. So for me, it's giving teachers a toolkit and honestly just a list of texts to begin inviting students to critically analyze their world, to begin to ask them to critically analyze their own histories and their own affective or emotional responses to what they're seeing, both in texts that are like picture books, but also to the text that exists in their life, right? To who they see on news outlets, on social media. And so that for me is the work that I hope to do, is to give students, my students, talking about folks who are future educators, future English educators, the confidence to walk into a classroom not knowing what's going to happen, but being able to respond to the realities that we and our students are living through simultaneously, and preparing us all for a future that is indeed more just. And so that's what I see my work as hopefully doing. You know, what it actually does, we'll see. But I hope that I, at the very least, am planting a seed. And also providing infinite resources. So I always tell my students on the last day, our class is done, right? Congratulations, you made it. I'm tired too. But also like, I'm always here, right? You have my email. When you need something, I'm in this because I care deeply about creating a more just society, a more just world. When you need something, reach out to me. It's literally my job to be prepared to help you find the resources that you need. So I was a K-12 teacher. So before I went back to graduate school to really start asking questions about children's literature and what it can do in terms of representations in the world, I taught for several years. So first I taught in North Carolina, in Charlotte. I taught in an inner city school that was Title I. And I taught English inclusion, which is sort of a particular way of talking about special needs students in North Carolina. So I had a teacher that would come in. Many of my students would have IEPs or individual education plans, which meant that we needed to take time to understand how they were unique learners, right? How they engage with text perhaps a bit differently and how we support them towards achieving the same goals as any other students was expected to achieve in sort of North Carolina. So I was and am from the Deep South. So to return to North Carolina was really important to me. I'd spent several years sort of studying abroad and I wanted to see other things in the world. And to come back to North Carolina was incredibly important because I was back in my own home space. And to be clear, I'm a South Carolinian, so please don't get that confused. I always am at war with North Carolinians, but they're also lovely. And I was very proud to teach there in a high school. And so what was my favorite book to teach? So in my second year of teaching there, I taught Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a book by Zora Neale Hurston, who is an incredible anthropologist and brilliant woman who is really known in terms, or scholastically and academically, for like capturing the vernacular of African-American communities in the Everglades, particularly in Florida, or at least this is true for Their Eyes Were Watching God. And many of my students spoke using Black American English, right? And so it was a way to hear and understand different modes of speech outside of sort of this very prim and proper sort of English books that they had encountered in previous years of schooling. So I found that book to be brilliant, not only because Zora Neale Hurston in the book is just beautiful and it sort of raises questions about sexuality, it raises questions about racial dynamics in the Deep South. It thinks about autonomy and gender in really incredible ways. It's beautifully written. But also like Zora Neale Hurston was just such an incredible character and person. So I remember she is 100%, so she would do this sort of anthropological work and she did a lot of that in Haiti, for example. And she was convinced that she saw the last zombie in the world. And so there's actually a picture, I think in Times Magazine, of this like zombie that she had sort of captured and like seen, and she talks about it. And so, and there's videos of her like singing that's just like beautiful. And so I really loved bringing her to life in an incredible way for students, but also creating a space for my students to engage with a text that often had been sort of cataloged as for 12th graders, and often for cataloged for 12th graders who were in honors or in IB, the International Baccalaureate program that was part and parcel of that school. And I just was like, no, my kids can do this, right? This is a text that matters. We've done a lot of other cool literature in here. We did The Life of Pi, which was fun, but also removed in particular ways. And I felt that it was important for students to be engaging and seeing themselves represented in books, but also to sort of mobilize that into the ways that they analyze their own communities in Charlotte. And so that book provided that opportunity. And it's not really YA and not canonical, but it is sort of canonical, and it was important. So we listened to it together, right? We listened to Ruby Dee read it, and it was stunning. And we spent a lot of time diving very deeply into the like elements of the world that mattered to them. So that was probably my favorite book. I know it's not YA. I would say as someone who's a bit older, and have spent a lot of years in graduate school, I didn't understand the value of young adult literature. And frankly, it would have been very difficult to get that approved in my school. Now, as like an older person, I would have made different choices, and I would have just brought the books that I thought mattered into my classroom, and would have, as I like to say, and as a teacher coach once said to me, be bold and lay low, right? And so, you got to take some risks sometime as an educator. And sometimes that meant that when we needed to engage topics that were going on in the world, or topics that were relevant that they were experiencing in the school, where they felt like their voices were not being heard, that their bodies and their bodily autonomy was not being respected, we had to close the door and have some real conversations. And so a bit older and perhaps a bit more experienced in terms of education, and someone who just loves YA to its very core at this point, I would have made different decisions. I wish that The Hate U Give existed when I was teaching, in 2012, through 2015, but it didn't. But there were other great books that I should have been looking into. So I feel remiss, and I'm trying to make up for I always tell my students today at San Jose State, I'm like, don't make the mistakes that I made. Like, oh my gosh, like here's this terrible thing that I did. Please don't do that. So I'm trying to make up for it now, a little bit later. And then after I taught for a couple of years in Charlotte, I went and taught abroad. And so I actually did a Fulbright in Paris, France. So I was teaching in the suburbs. And what I saw there was another thing that led me back to graduate school, because I was like, okay, like I love the school that I'm at. I love my students. There was a lot of animosity between administrators and students at the school that I was teaching in, frankly. And I knew that the answers to great pedagogy in terms of English education, that I wasn't going to get them by staying in that school. And that broke my heart because I wanted to stay with my students who were fantastic. But I knew that even for me as a teacher, it wasn't sustainable. What I was encountering there with the administration was not sustainable for me as a teacher at that time. As someone with anxiety, it wasn't sustainable. And I needed to find different ways of approaching teaching. I needed to find different ways of supporting teachers and answering the questions that I had about books and representation. So I went to France thinking I was going to magically find it, like, oh, I'll go to another country and it's going to be great, you know. That was not what I found. I worked in La Courneuve, which is sort of a suburb of Paris up north. It's known for sort of race riots that occurred, I believe, in the 70s. Don't get me, I'm not a historian. And so people have very bad associations, frankly, with La Courneuve. A lot of times with French folks who I was associating with or who I'd encountered, like, oh, you taught in La Courneuve? And I was like, it was wonderful. I taught with mostly first generation French folks who had immigrated from all over the world, primarily from North Africa, but not exclusively. And it was incredible to see that in France, the same sort of racial inequities that are pervasive and endemic to American schooling existed. It just looked a little different, but it existed in almost the exact same way. The way that opportunities and access existed were almost identical. And so, frankly, I got frustrated. I was like, well, damn it. I thought I was going to, you know, find the answer in sort of my naivete, but also sort of beauty, right? I was like, I want to figure it out. But that's what led me back to grad school. Right now, I teach 3 courses primarily. The first is a children's literature course, which is necessary for folks seeking what's called multiple subject credentialization in California. So this is mostly for elementary educators. So I teach that course. And it's really about the cultural politics of children's literature. So more than how do we dive into this text and like, how do we understand what Dr. Seuss was doing? It's more like, how do we as teachers confront the fact that Dr. Seuss was a racist, right? Which has been well documented. How do we understand the fact that he's one of the most commonly taught children's authors, particularly in terms of picture books in the United States and frankly, the world? And do we want to put a racist author and their work in front of the students that we teach, right? Do we separate author from work? Or is it incumbent upon us as educators, as future educators, to introduce our students to the fact that Dr. Seuss had like known racist caricatures that he presented during World War II, right? So we sort of engage these questions of the cultural politics surrounding children's literature. Also, everything that's been going on with J.K. Rowling, right, has been a huge storm. She sort of really revealed herself to be what the common term is TERF, which is like trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is someone who in the core of it doesn't view trans women as women. And so what do we do when we hold such deep love and nostalgia for a book like Harry Potter, right? It was really central to my own childhood. With my father, I wasn't allowed to read it. And so I would go to my mom's every other weekend. And my mom was much more sort of liberal and open-minded in a lot of ways. And she would go and snag the books for me and let me read them really quickly over the weekend before I got back to my father's. And so there's a lot of love and nostalgia for that book, but I refuse to teach her in my classes, frankly. I teach about her, but I will never invite students to purchase anything that is connected to Harry Potter, and especially not books, because I think it propels what is published and it supports to give her a huge platform to say really terrible things about trans folk, to say really terrible things, also some sort of anti-Semitic issues in Harry Potter, some really Asian American sentiments in Harry Potter as well. So we really are grappling with these questions of like, how do we put forward, how do we know what to choose, right? When we enter into a classroom, when these are the books that we know and love, right? Do we have to give up that love? Or do we have to contextualize that love? Teaching is an infinitely political act. The choices that we make, the text we invite, it matters, and it matters deeply. And if we want to create a more socially just world, we have to interrogate and be prepared to understand the impact of every decision that we make as an English educator. So that's my children's lit piece. And I think you can probably see some of the connections with my work. I also teach a class on writing and the young writer. And so I feel like I have to like unveil the truth of like, I don't view myself as a writing scholar. Even though like I taught writing, I took classes in writing in graduate school. I was like, oh my God, I have to teach writing. I'm so nervous. How am I going to make this my own? And so Writing in the Young Writer is a class that invites people, number one, to see themselves as writers. But it also asks people to expand what counts as writing by young people. So there is some very tried and true things of like, what does a writer's workshop look like? Right. And so I have students actually do a mini lesson where they choose some element of writing. So this might be something grammatical, this might be something structural, this might be writing a thesis. And then they set up that mini lesson to then invite their peers in the class to work with other folks in a writing workshop and to begin practicing. Because in writing research, we kind of believe and understand that writing and learning to write happens through writing, right? More than learning about writing. So I provide them with sort of this quick, easy toolkit of like, what are you going to do? How are you going to get young people to write? But then we couple that with really rigorous intellectual considerations of what counts as writing. So I always love to ask, is TikTok writing, right? If we've learned that writing is a process and it's not just about the product, and you have to go through all of the stages of drafting, and you have to go through and planning and brainstorming and editing and revisions, and that is what makes something writing, for instance, then if you do all of that in making a TikTok, doesn't it count? What does it mean when you invite people to bring that into their classrooms, right? And particularly in the face of testing where traditionally in academic context, that hasn't counted, right? In terms of writing. However, so we also invite people to bring in writing from and their own identities into the classroom, to bring their own stories into what they're writing, and to think really expansively about what writing is and what counts, so that when they go to their young people and they see them texting up a storm, they're like, oh, okay, let's figure out how we take this out of school writing literacy that these students are also experts at, right? How do we move that into a classroom space and think about how that might sort of motivate writing in a different way, preparing them for the academic spaces, if that's what we choose to do, or inviting them to write in ways that immediately matter. So I remember when I was teaching high school in North Carolina, I would sort of teach them a lot of the forms of 5-paragraph essays, for example, but they would be doing it for a change.org petition to change something that mattered to them. So there was a lesbian woman of color in one of my classes, and she wasn't allowed to wear a suit to prom. So she made a change.org petition where she used the skills that she was learning in writing to advocate for change from the administration in the school. And she sought support from the local community for that. And so I think what gets me excited about writing is realizing that like young people are storytellers, right? They have stories, they have funds of knowledge. They are people who know and people who understand the world and who elegantly like move through it and write through it. We as teachers have to be willing to recognize things that maybe we didn't learn in our own schooling counts as writing, right? And be willing to expand how we bring those things into our writing classroom. So that's my second class. And my third is a methods of teaching English class. So this is, what do? We are an English teacher going into a secondary context, so middle or high school. And what do we do on day one? Oh my Lord, we have to figure out a curriculum. We have to figure out how to plan a lesson. We have to figure out how to do instruction. We have to figure out what books to pick, how to do writing, and make all of that count in a context of a district where you have certain mandates that you're going to have to uphold, where you have certain learning objectives that you have to teach. So it's literally a step-by-step beginning toolkit for either sort of pre-service teachers or in-service teachers to support them in being prepared to teach secondary English. And I think my stamp on that class, it's filtered throughout it because we actually start by focusing on what counts as English, right? When we say English, whose Englishes are we imagining? Whose Englishes are we saying that counts, and how does that shape what we teach? So the beginning is really values-based. What is it that's going to lead you to be a teacher for the rest of your life? As I like to say, I'm not really interested in creating two-year teachers, right? And what's going to get you to wake up every day and go back to that classroom, even when you're tired, right? Even when it's really hard, because teaching to this day is the hardest thing. Teaching high school was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, period. And so what is it that's what are the values that you need to know that are central to how you lead a classroom? So we start there. And then we start moving into more of the skill sets of like building a unit, building lesson plans, thinking about assessments. But throughout all of it, I have them do what I call mini lessons. And now I'm sort of just shifting to calling them like micro teaching. But we have a shared text. So this is where I feel like my stamp came in. I used Randy Rebet's book, Patron Saints of Nothing, which is one of the first books about Filipino-American experience. Well, it is the first to become a finalist for the National Book Award. He is a Bay Area teacher. It is an amazing text that follows one young man who is mixed race. He is Filipino and white. And he has sort of come upon the reality that a cousin whom he remembers from when he lived in the Philippines is just missing. Right. And so he goes to the Philippines and has to navigate what it means to be Filipino American, right, in that context, the privileges that he holds as someone who identifies as American, but also the realities of going back to a home space where the language is both something intimate to him and also something foreign, where the cultural norms are both something intimate to him and something foreign. And so it's this beautiful back and forth. And the sort of dedication to it from Randy Rebet is like for the hyphenated. And so we actually use that and we read it together throughout the semester. It's a young adult novel. And they perform different micro teaching elements. So they pick a standard that they want to try and focus on. They teach an element of the book. And over the span of the semester, they are actually, though they probably don't know that, well, I know they don't know it initially, they're getting all of the different tools, confidences, and a bunch of teaching strategies and activities to just put into a unit that they can use immediately when they go into their own classrooms in the next year or two. So I feel like that's my stamp on the methods class. I love that book. I think it's really beautiful. My students really enjoyed it. And it gives us a unifying piece to talk about and concentrate when we're trying to think abstractly about teaching and we need to pull it into something more concrete. How do we apply a critical lens to this text? Does it make sense to pull in sort of a gender lens or a feminist lens or a critical race theory lens or a queer theory lens? Like, what does the text afford? Start with your students' stories. They each have one. They're each incredible, and they're each people who know something. They know a lot of things that you will never know, frankly. Creating a space to listen to who they are, creating a space for them to reflect on their own histories, and then using that as the launching off point for a class, I think it makes all the difference. Relationships first. That's the sort of core of what I think should be true for all teaching, frankly. Let me talk about my work-life integration. So I want to start by saying it's something that I am actively working on. As a function of being an anxious person, work feels like something that provides control, right? It feels like in a world where social media can be overwhelming, where the news can be overwhelming, work is sort of calming to me, to be perfectly frank. That being said, drawing boundaries is something that I'm working on fastidiously. So I'm trying to rediscover aspects of myself that I sort of let go in graduate school and the constant push to publish and to do. So I have been doing, as simple as it sounds, I have been doing an adult paint by numbers that a dear friend gave to me. So I'll just like put on music or put on television and just sit down on my floor because I live in a small apartment and don't have the capacity to be anywhere else. I'll just sit on the floor and I'll just like paint for an hour or two. And doing that sort of kinesthetic work, I find very important. This is to like creating space to do yoga, creating space to go on a walk and talk to folks who matter to me. So everyone that I know almost is on the East Coast. I was born and raised in the Deep South. I went to school on the East Coast my entire life. So everybody is back there. So creating space to go outside, to get some air, to be in the sun, and to talk to my grandmother. She sort of notoriously is a sort of busybody in a tiny little town in rural South Carolina. And as she likes to say, she was talking about someone. I was like, Grandma, that's gossipy. Like you know, like, do you, and she was mad because someone had been gossiping about her. And I was like, well, maybe we should think about this. And her response was, I'm not a gossip. Or she said, no, I'm not nosy. She's like, I'm not nosy. I'm just interested in people. So for me, part of that integration is listening to my grandmother be very interested in people and just giving myself that hour right? And knowing that when I come back to my work later, that I'm going to be in an infinitely better space than I was before because I took the hour. I'm more productive. I'm less frustrated. The other big sort of news is I'm getting a dog in a month. So that is something I've wanted for a very long time. So I'm trying to create boundaries by being forced to take care of things, but also things that I know will take care of me in return. So I'm very excited to be doing that. Otherwise, like again, the sort of anxious person that I am, structure is really important to me. I love, 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 love structure. I do my best writing in the morning. So I'm usually up around 6 or 6:30, get coffee because before coffee, no work is happening. And then I sit down and usually start writing on a project. I love the morning because it feels like the world hasn't woken up quite yet. It feels very calm. And so that's when I'm able to sort of do the academic and publishing pieces. And I've actually been sort of just as even teaching 3 new preps this semester, like I've put out as much scholarship as I did in graduate school. So I feel like I've been able to maintain the pace that I had when I was dissertating and doing all of that other work. And it feels very nice to me. And then about 8, 9, all the emails start coming in and so many other things need to be tended to. So having that structure is very, very helpful to me as a person. Loving the mornings and just honoring them as quiet time is super important. And then sort of interposing when I'm tired, listening to my body, right? Knowing that I'm tired or I'm frustrated and I just need to go do something else for a little bit. The work will be there when I get back. And understanding that like my work, I love it. I think it's important. Who I understand myself to be, my values and my work are intimately intertwined, but knowing that there are incredible folks who are also doing this work alongside me. And when I need to take a break, I can do that, right? The work will move forward, right? And in fact, if I am not taking care of myself, the work can't progress. It can't move forward. And I can't be the best for my students. Even when I was teaching K-12, I learned very quickly, Mr. Coleman at the time, like Mr. Coleman needs to sleep, right? I prioritize sleep because if not, I'm short-tempered. I'm not as willing to like spend time thinking alongside students as I want to, honoring their realities as I want to. And so knowing these things about myself means that like I usually am in bed at the latest by 10, usually. And I know my friends call me a grandma. It's fine. It's who I am. It's my truth. I've accepted it. But I just sort of think the sort of classic, like to thine own self be true, know who you are, know what you need, so that you can be the best educator that you can be, the best researcher that you can be, and honoring when you just need to stop for a little bit. And I say that because I'm also trying to give myself that advice. So it's not just for like my fellow academics and peers, it's for me too, like take a break. It's been a real pleasure getting to share a little bit of who I am with each of you. I look forward to being able to connect beyond the bounds of our own 4 walls in a world that will hopefully be, post-quarantine and post-COVID. And I look forward to very long and hopefully very meaningful futures with each of you. So thank you.